The sun was barely rising over the quiet fields of the American Midwest when the army truck rattled down the dusty road, carrying a group of German prisoners of war. Most of the young men inside sat silently, staring through the barred windows. They had been captured in North Africa and France, marched through camps, loaded onto ships, and finally brought to a place they never imagined they would see in their lifetimes: rural America. 23-year-old Wilhelm Krauss sat closest to the window, his hands clenched on his knees. Back home, he had grown up in a Bavarian farming village, where barns were painted red and neighbors greeted each other by name. Yet here he was, halfway across the world, expecting hostility, suspicion, perhaps even hatred. Nazi propaganda had told them Americans were ruthless, undisciplined, and eager to humiliate defeated Germans. But the moment the truck turned into the long driveway of a modest farmhouse, Wilhelm's expectations began to crack. A tall American farmer stepped out onto the porch, broad-shouldered, calm, and wearing suspenders. He wiped his hands on his work pants and glanced at the approaching soldiers. The lieutenant accompanying the prisoners climbed out first and waved Wilhelm and two others to follow. The young POWs stiffened, bracing themselves for whatever came next. The officer approached the farmer with a clipboard. "Morning," he said. "We've brought the workers you requested. Name's Tom Miller." Wilhelm froze. Miller? That sounded exactly like Mahler, one of the most common surnames back home. He squinted, wondering if he had misheard. But then the farmer walked up, extended a steady hand, and said with a friendly smile, almost as if he were greeting neighbors instead of enemy soldiers, "Willkommen. I'm Thomas Muller. My grandparents came from Hesse." The German soldiers stared at him, speechless. One of Wilhelm's companions, Ernst, finally muttered, "Das kann nicht wahr sein. This can't be real." He glanced at Wilhelm, as if waiting for someone to confirm that they weren't imagining the moment. But Wilhelm said nothing. He was too stunned. The farmer, this American, had just spoken to them in clear, warm German. Wilhelm felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion wash over him. For months, he had expected cruelty. Instead, he was being welcomed by a man who shared his language, his heritage, even his family roots. It was as if a piece of home had quietly planted itself in the middle of American farmland. Thomas Muller motioned for them to follow him to the barn. "My parents still spoke German at home," he explained. "I learned English in school, but the old language, it never leaves you." As the prisoners walked, they passed a mailbox. Painted on it, in big bold letters, was the surname, Muller. Not Miller. Not some Americanized version. The original spelling, the original identity, proudly displayed. Wilhelm felt something inside him shift. He had been told Americans were nothing like Germans. Different values, different culture, different way of life. Yet this farm looked familiar. The smell of hay, the wooden beams in the barn, even the apple trees lining the fence all reminded him of his father's land back in Bavaria. He suddenly realized how little he truly knew about this country. The farmer showed them their tasks for the day, speaking patiently and without judgment. When he handed Wilhelm a set of gloves, he said, "You'll find the work here isn't too different from back home." Those simple words hit Wilhelm harder than he expected. Back home. For the first time since his capture, the word didn't hurt as much. As he stepped into the field, sunlight warming his face, he whispered again under his breath, this time not in disbelief, but in quiet wonder. Maybe this really is real. When Wilhelm and the others first arrived in the United States, They had no idea that they were joining one of the largest groups of foreign prisoners ever held on American soil. By 1945, more than 400,000 German POWs were scattered across camps from Texas to Minnesota, from the Carolinas to California. But behind that enormous number were individual stories. Young men pulled from farms, cities, and villages all across Germany, Austria, and occupied Europe. Many, like Wilhelm, had grown up far from the political centers of Berlin or Munich. They were sons of farmers, factory workers, local craftsmen, ordinary people swept into a global war. Some had been drafted before their 18th birthdays. Others had volunteered, believing it was their duty. Only a small fraction were convinced Nazis. Most were simply soldiers caught in a conflict they barely understood. After their capture in North Africa, Italy, or France, they were transported to American ports, often New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans. The journey across the Atlantic was tense at first, with submarines prowling the ocean, but once they arrived, many were stunned by what they saw. Clean, organized camps, steady meals, and treatment under the rules of the Geneva Convention. It was nothing like the harsh conditions they had imagined. One of Wilhelm's campmates, a quiet young man named Otto Becker, had been captured at Monte Cassino. He often spoke of marching for days without food, of exhaustion so deep he could barely lift his rifle. He expected revenge when he surrendered. Instead, an American soldier had handed him a chocolate bar and said, "The war's over for you, kid." Otto never forgot that moment. Another prisoner, Friedrich Fritz Lang, had joined the German army at 19. Back home in the Black Forest, he had worked as a carpenter's apprentice. When he first stepped into the camp in Nebraska, he whispered to Wilhelm, "It smells like home, pine boards and sawdust." The Americans had built barracks so similar to the ones Fritz helped construct that he felt almost comforted. The camps themselves were small towns. Wooden huts, mess halls, watchtowers, and huge open fields. There were strict rules, of course, but also unexpected freedoms. Prisoners organized orchestras, built theatrical stages, crafted furniture, and even formed soccer leagues. Some camps printed their own newspapers. Others hosted art classes taught by former university students or painters who had been drafted into the war. What surprised the POWs most was the work program. Instead of sitting in camp all day, many were sent to farms, timber companies, or food processing plants. America was facing a massive labor shortage. Millions of young men were overseas fighting, so POW labor became essential. The government paid them fair wages according to international law, and many saved the money to send home after the war. Wilhelm learned quickly that the prisoners he lived with were not a single unified group. Some were loyal to the Nazi cause, at least at first. Others were openly critical. Many were simply exhausted, longing for peace. At night, the barracks would fill with quiet conversations. Hopes for letters from home, fears about bombings in Germany, or confusion about America itself. "Who would have imagined we'd end up here?" Otto once said as they lay in their bunks. Wilhelm stared at the ceiling. "If someone told me a year ago," he replied, "I would have laughed." Yet here they were, tens of thousands of German soldiers working in fields, factories, and orchards across the United States. They were strangers in a foreign land, but they were also learning, little by little, that the world was far bigger than the borders they had grown up within. And, without knowing it, they were about to discover that many Americans looked, sounded, and lived more like them than they ever expected. When Wilhelm stepped onto Thomas Muller's farm for the first time, he did not yet understand that the American Midwest was filled with families who shared stories much like his own. Only later would he learn that millions of Germans had crossed the Atlantic long before him, seeking farmland, freedom, and a chance to build new lives. Their descendants now formed some of the most deeply rooted communities in the American heartland. Long before the war, the valleys of Wisconsin, the plains of Nebraska, and the rolling fields of Iowa had echoed with German voices. In the 1800s, entire villages from Prussia, Bavaria, and Württemberg had packed their belongings, boarded crowded ships, and sailed toward America. Many had been farmers who struggled with poor harvests, high taxes, or political unrest back home. They came for land, for opportunity, and for a new beginning. By the early 20th century, towns across the Midwest had German bakeries on Main Street, Lutheran churches beside cornfields, and schoolhouses where children learned English during the day and heard German prayers at night. But when World War I erupted, many of these families hid their heritage, fearing suspicion. Street names were changed, newspapers shut down, and German-language schools quietly disappeared. Still, at home, behind closed doors, traditions survived. And it was into this hidden world of German-American heritage that Wilhelm, Otto, and Fritz had unexpectedly stepped. One evening, after their first week working on the Muller farm, Thomas invited the three prisoners to sit outside near the barn. It was early autumn, and the air smelled of bonfires and fallen leaves. Thomas's wife, Anna, brought out plates with warm apple cake. The prisoners hesitated. They had not expected hospitality, but she simply smiled and said, "My grandmother called it Apfelkuchen." Wilhelm stared at the dessert, stunned. "Apfelkuchen," he repeated softly. "Just like in Bavaria." Thomas nodded. "My grandmother was born near Frankfurt. She used to cook this every harvest season." The three Germans exchanged looks, half disbelief, half wonder. Here they sat, thousands of kilometers from home, eating cake made from the same recipe their grandmothers used. The experience felt surreal. Later that night, Thomas told them that many towns in the region had originally been founded by German immigrants. "You boys will hear a lot of familiar names around here," he said. "Schmidt, Schneider, Klein, Becker. The mailman's name is Weber, and the feed store is run by the Kruger family. Wilhelm Laukit softly. Those are the names of half the people in my village." Thomas shrugged. "They were our neighbors too, just on the other side of an ocean." As the days went by, Wilhelm began noticing the small details that revealed the depth of German influence in America. The barn architecture reminded him of the farms in southern Germany. Long, simple wooden buildings built for hard winters. In the farmhouse kitchen, he saw blue and white ceramic dishes that looked exactly like the ones his mother had collected. When Anna spoke to her children, the kids sometimes answered in English, sometimes in an old-fashioned German dialect. He realized that these families had preserved pieces of their ancestors' lives. Even after decades, the traditions had not disappeared. They had simply blended into the American landscape. One Sunday morning, while the prisoners were repairing fences, they heard singing coming from a nearby church. The melody drifted across the fields, familiar and gentle. It was a hymn Wilhelm had sung as a child. "Grosser Gott, we're Loben Dyke." He stopped, leaning on his shovel. "That's impossible," he whispered. But it wasn't. German immigrants had brought their songs, recipes, holidays, and stories with them. Even after generations, many of those traditions remained woven into everyday life in the heartland. For the German POWs, this discovery was both comforting and confusing. They had come expecting a foreign, unfamiliar world. Instead, they found echoes of their own history, reflected in the families, farms, and towns around them. And slowly, Wilhelm began to understand a truth that would follow him long after the war. America was not just a nation of strangers. It was a country shaped by the footsteps of people who had once walked the same roads, eaten the same food, and spoken the same language as he did. It was a land where German roots ran deep, so deep that even prisoners of war could feel a sense of home. The first time Wilhelm and the other prisoners met a German American outside the farm, the moment arrived so unexpectedly that it felt almost staged, like a scene from a film. It happened on a crisp October morning, as the POW truck rattled down a gravel road toward the local grain cooperative. The harvest season was in full swing, and the farm needed every available hand to move corn and sorghum before the weather turned. Wilhelm, Otto, and Fritz sat in the back, their jackets pulled tight against the cold. They had learned enough by now not to assume anything, but they still felt like outsiders moving through a foreign land. The truck pulled up beside a long wooden loading dock. Dozens of farmers were already there, shouting instructions, checking wagons, and guiding horses. Dust filled the air as workers hoisted grain sacks onto platforms. As the POWs climbed down, a man with a thick mustache and wide-brimmed hat strode over. His boots thudded loudly on the planks, and his stern expression made Wilhelm instinctively straighten his back. He expected a lecture, maybe suspicion, or worse, resentment. Instead, the man stopped in front of them and said, in perfectly fluent German,
Na, Jans, seid ihr bereit zu arbeiten?
"Well, boys, you ready to get to work?" The prisoners froze.
Wilhelm blinkt.
Otto looked as if he had just seen a ghost. Fritz glanced at the guard, unsure if he was allowed to answer. But the guard merely shrugged. "Go on," he said. "Mr. Schneider speaks your language better than English."
Schneider.
Another unmistakably German name. The farmer grinned when he saw their stunned expressions. "My parents came from Baden," he said proudly. "Half the folks around here did." He slapped a hand on Wilhelm's shoulder and pointed toward a wagon. "You three take those sacks. And don't worry, I won't bite. My grandmother would haunt me if I mistreated fellow Germans." The remark made Otto laugh out loud, the sound echoing across the loading dock. And suddenly the atmosphere shifted. Workers who had seemed distant only moments earlier now nodded or waved. Some spoke English, others attempted German phrases, sometimes clumsy, sometimes surprisingly fluent. One older man approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Name's Weber," he said, pronouncing it Weber, just as it would be in Germany. "My father came from Hamburg. Still miss the bread from home." He winked at Wilhelm. "Bet you do too." Throughout the morning, the prisoners worked alongside the farmers, passing sacks hand to hand, loading wagons, and sweeping the grain scattered on the ground. But what stuck with Wilhelm wasn't the labor, it was the conversations. One man complained about his stubborn cows in a dialect that sounded exactly like the one spoken in Wilhelm's village. Another whistled a folk tune Wilhelm recognized instantly. A woman delivering coffee to the workers used the phrase "Komm schon," Kinder, come on, children, a phrase Wilhelm had heard his mother say every morning before school. Felt surreal. These people lived thousands of kilometers away from Europe, had never seen the Rhine or the Alps, and yet their habits, their voices, even their humor felt so strikingly familiar. During lunch, the prisoners were given sandwiches and sat under a large oak tree. Mr. Schneider joined them, lighting a pipe as he spoke. "You know," he said, blowing smoke into the cool air, "when my grandparents came here, they brought everything they could carry: language, music, recipes, even the stories they told as children. He tapped his pipe against his boot. We may be American now, but we didn't forget where we came from. Wilhelm studied the farmers around him, laughing, shouting, working, and it struck him that these were people who had blended the old world with the new so seamlessly that it seemed natural. They were American, yes, but also German in ways that felt deep and authentic. For Wilhelm and his fellow POWs, the experience was quietly transformative. They had expected hostility, but instead found familiarity. They had expected strangers, but found echoes of home. As the truck carried them back to the camp that afternoon, Otto leaned back and whispered, almost to himself, "It's strange. They're not just like us. They are us, just living on the other side of the world." Wilhelm nodded slowly, watching the fields blur past the window, and he realized something he had never imagined when the war began. Sometimes the enemy did not look like an enemy at all. The first time Wilhelm realized that language could soften the walls between captor and captive, it happened almost by accident. He was repairing a fence post on the Muller farm when Thomas's youngest daughter, Emma, wandered over with a bucket of nails. She was no more than 10, her blonde braids bouncing with every step. She looked at Wilhelm shyly, then said in careful German,
Hier, Papa sagte, du brauchst das.
"Here, Papa said you need this."
Wilhelm starret, speechless.
She spoke with the sing-song accent of a child raised in America, but the words were unmistakably German. He knelt to take the bucket, and she smiled, proud of herself. "Did I say it right?" she asked.
Wilhelm nodded.
"Perfect." Emma grinned and ran back toward the porch, calling out to her mother in English. Wilhelm watched her go, a strange warmth spreading through him. Moments like that, simple, innocent, unexpected, were beginning to dissolve the fear he had carried for months. Soon, he noticed that language wasn't just a tool for communication. It was a bridge. One afternoon, as the POWs loaded hay bales into the barn, Thomas joined them with a jug of cold water. He handed it to Otto and said casually,
Pass das mal weiter.
"Pass that along." Otto raised an eyebrow. "You speak German better than some people I know back home." Thomas chuckled. "My grandmother never let us forget it." What began as small exchanges soon grew into full conversations. The prisoners felt safe enough to ask questions about farm work, about American customs, even about life before the war. And the farmers felt comfortable enough to answer, sometimes laughing at the misunderstandings caused by differences in dialect or slang. One evening, after finishing repairs on a tractor, Fritz sat on the porch steps with Thomas. The sun was sinking behind the cornfields, turning everything gold. "You know," Fritz said softly, "I didn't expect Americans to understand us. Not like this." Thomas shrugged. "We're more alike than different. My grandfather used to say, 'A German is a German, no matter where he hangs his hat.'" Fritz smiled at that. "We used to say something similar, just never imagined it would include Americans." As weeks passed, the prisoners found themselves forming small but meaningful bonds with the people they worked beside. Not friendships, at least not openly, but something quieter, a mutual respect, a recognition of shared roots. Language made it easy to see the humanity in each other. During lunch breaks, the farmers told stories about their parents' immigration. The long ship journeys, the struggle to learn English, the determination to keep German traditions alive in a new land. In return, the POWs shared memories of their own homes, festivals, farms, mountains, lakes. They spoke of bread baked in stone ovens, of winter sledding, of the songs their mothers sang after supper. Sometimes the conversations grew heavy. The farmers asked what the prisoners believed about the war. The POWs answered carefully, aware of the thin line they walked. But even then, the language softened everything. Disagreements felt human, not hostile. One day, Mr. Schneider from the grain cooperative approached Wilhelm during a loading shift. "You remind me of my cousin back in Bremen," he said. "Same way of speaking, same way of thinking."
Wilhelm chuckled quietly.
"I never thought an American would say that to me." Mr. Schneider patted him on the back. "You forget, boy. Half of us used to be German ourselves." But the most surprising bond formed between Otto and an elderly farmer named Karl, who lived on the next property over. Karl was an immigrant himself, born in Württemberg. The first time he heard Otto speak, he squinted and said, "You're Swabian, aren't you?" Otto's jaw dropped. "You can tell?"
Karl laughed loudly.
"Of course I can tell. I left home almost 50 years ago, but I still know the sound of my own people." From that day on, Otto and Karl spent their lunch breaks talking in thick Swabian dialect, laughing over expressions neither had heard since childhood. For Wilhelm, moments like these chipped away at everything he thought he knew about the world. Enemy and ally began to blur. Captor and captive became less important than the simple truth that they understood each other, deeply, instinctively, through the language they shared. And sometimes, in the quiet between conversations, Wilhelm wondered if these unexpected bonds would be the one thing he carried home when the war finally ended. The rhythm of life on the Muller farm settled into Wilhelm's bones more easily than he expected. It wasn't the life of a prisoner, nor the rigid military routine he had endured for years. It was something entirely different, something strangely familiar yet undeniably new. Every morning, long before the sun climbed over the horizon, Thomas would knock on the bunkhouse door. "Time to rise," he'd call. "Cows don't wait for daylight." Wilhelm would stretch, listening to the faint lowing of cattle and the crackle of wind moving through the cornfields. In Germany, his mornings had begun with church bells. Here, it was the hum of farm machinery warming up, the rustle of worn boots on wooden floors, and the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen window. Work started early. The POWs hauled water, repaired equipment, milked cows, cleaned stalls, and cut firewood for the coming winter. Yet, unlike the military labor camps they once feared, this work felt purposeful. The farmers depended on them, not as prisoners, but as laborers filling a gap left by American sons who were fighting overseas. One crisp morning, Thomas handed Wilhelm a pair of leather gloves and pointed to the tractor. "You ever driven one of these?" Wilhelm hesitated. "Not exactly this model." Thomas climbed up, gesturing for him to join. "Close enough. You'll learn." The lesson lasted less than an hour, and by noon Wilhelm was steering the machine along neat rows of corn, the engine's steady rumble echoing across the fields. When he glanced toward the farmhouse, he saw Anna watching from the porch, giving him an approving nod. It struck him then how much trust they were receiving. They were, after all, enemy soldiers. Yet here he was, operating expensive machinery, walking freely across open fields, working beside the family with only a single guard stationed at the edge of the property. It wasn't what he had imagined America would be. Afternoons brought different chores. Sometimes they mended fences with Karl, the old farmer from next door. Sometimes Anna asked them to stack firewood or help clean the barn loft. On Sundays, the work slowed. The family attended church while the prisoners stayed behind, tending only to the animals. The farm became quiet, peaceful, a place untouched by war. One Sunday, while splitting logs, Otto leaned on his axe and said, "You know, if someone dropped me here without telling me where I was, I could swear this was home." Fritz laughed. "Except the barns are bigger, and the tractors don't break every 5 minutes," Wilhelm added with a grin. They all laughed, freely, naturally. It was a sound none of them had made often during the war. But farm life wasn't just work and quiet moments. It brought surprises, too. Once, when the barn roof sprang a leak after a heavy storm, Thomas gathered everyone, family, workers, and POWs alike, to repair it before the next rain. They passed shingles in a steady rhythm, cracking jokes in a mix of German and English. Even the guard helped, hammering nails with more enthusiasm than skill. At the end of the day, soaked and exhausted, Thomas sliced watermelon on the porch. "You boys earned this," he said, handing them each a piece. The sweet juice dripped down Wilhelm's hands as he ate. Watermelon was a rarity back home. Here it was a sign of summer, a reward for honest labor. Life on the farm revealed an America Wilhelm had never imagined. An America built on cooperation, shared effort, and quiet dignity. There were no political speeches, no crowds shouting slogans, no officers barking orders. Just families working hard to keep their land alive. And with each passing day, the prisoners saw more of the country's character in its simplest form. The generosity of neighbors, the pride in craftsmanship, the quiet resilience of people who had survived decades of hardship, from the Great Depression to dust storms to the uncertainty of war. One evening, as the sun dipped low and fireflies blinked along the fence line, Wilhelm stood alone beside the barn. The sky turned shades of orange and purple he had never seen in Germany. The air smelled of hay and distant wood smoke. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "This," he whispered, "is a different America. Not the America he had been warned about. Not the America he had feared. But an America built on honest work, open hearts, and a surprising familiarity that softened even the sharpest edges of war." For most of their lives, Wilhelm, Otto, and Fritz had been surrounded by stories. Stories repeated in newspapers, shouted in rallies, whispered in classrooms. Stories about America. Stories about the enemy. Stories meant to shape how young men thought, felt, and fought. By the time they reached the battlefield, those stories had hardened into certainty. But life on the American farms was slowly breaking that certainty apart. It began with small moments, details that didn't match the propaganda they had once believed. Wilhelm remembered sitting in a training barracks years earlier, listening to an officer describe Americans as loud, arrogant, and undisciplined. "They are greedy," the officer said, "soft from comfort and incapable of real work." But the first week on the Muller farm destroyed that image completely. Thomas Muller would rise before dawn every day, working harder than most officers Wilhelm had ever known. Anna balanced farm duties, children, and endless meals with the strength of someone who had weathered many storms. The neighbors worked long hours, side by side, showing a discipline and endurance that no propaganda film had ever acknowledged. "This can't be the people we were taught to fear," Fritz murmured one afternoon as they watched Thomas lift heavy hay bales with practiced ease. "They work harder than half the men in my old regiment." Another myth shattered during mealtime. Their instructors had once claimed that Americans lived wastefully, throwing away food and indulging in excess. But on the farm, nothing was wasted. Not a scrap of bread, Not a drop of milk, not a patch of land. Every resource was valued. Every meal was earned. Even more surprising was how the Americans treated the prisoners. Nazi propaganda had warned that captured soldiers would be tortured, starved, humiliated. And yet, here they were eating hearty meals, sleeping in warm bunkhouses, and being spoken to with a level of respect they never expected. One chilly morning, as Otto struggled to fix a broken latch on the chicken coop, Anna approached him with a steaming mug. "Here," she said. "Hot cocoa. You look frozen." Otto stared at her, confused. "For me," she smiled. "Of course. You're working in the cold, aren't you?" He took the mug slowly, almost afraid it might vanish. That evening by the bunkhouse stove, he whispered to Wilhelm, "They treat us like people, not prisoners, not enemies, just people." But perhaps the strongest myth to crumble was the idea that Americans hated Germans. Many POWs expected hostility, sneers, or rejection. Instead, they met farmers who spoke German, cooked German food, and knew German stories passed down from grandparents who had crossed the ocean decades earlier. One afternoon, while repairing a wagon wheel with Karl, the old Swabian immigrant, Otto confessed, "We were told Americans despise us."
Karl snorted.
"Nonsense. They despise the war, not the people caught in it." He tightened a bolt and added, "Most Americans here know what hardship feels like. They don't blame you for what their own boys are facing overseas." It was a perspective none of the prisoners had considered. Even the guards defied expectations. Instead of cruelty or constant suspicion, they showed patience and sometimes even humor. Wilhelm recalled one guard, Private Dawson, who joked in broken German every time he handed out mail. "Your girlfriend wrote again," he'd tease, even if Wilhelm had no girlfriend at all. Slowly, the POWs discovered a truth that no classroom lecture or military pamphlet had ever taught them. Stereotypes were fragile things. They crumbled when confronted with real people, people whose actions spoke louder than any propaganda. One evening, as they sat on the fence watching fireflies shimmer across the fields, Fritz said quietly, "I feel like everything I once believed is being rewritten here."
Wilhelm nodded.
"Not rewritten," he replied, "revealed." War had built walls in their minds. But here, in the quiet heartland of America, those walls were breaking. Shattered not by arguments or force, but by kindness, humanity, and the simple truth that people were rarely what the propaganda claimed they were. For many of the German POWs, the greatest surprise about life in the American heartland wasn't the landscape, the kindness, or the easy smiles of the locals. It was the familiarity, echoes of home hidden in kitchens, porches, barns, and the little rituals of rural life. At first, these similarities felt like coincidences, but day by day, they revealed something deeper, the cultural threads linking the German homeland to the American Midwest. The first moment of recognition came through food. On a cool autumn morning, Wilhelm followed the farmer's wife, Anna Mahler, into the kitchen to help with peeling apples. The smell alone stopped him in his tracks: cinnamon, warm dough, and a buttery richness that tugged at memories of his mother's kitchen in Hesse. Anna laughed at his wide eyes. "Smells like home, doesn't it?" "What is it?" Wilhelm asked. "Apfelkuchen," she said casually. "My grandmother's recipe."
Wilhelm blinked.
"But that's German." She shrugged with a smile. "So were my grandparents." That afternoon, when the slice of warm apple cake touched his tongue, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: the comfort of childhood. The other POWs had similar experiences: sauerkraut bubbling in a pot, sausages smoking in the shed, even homemade pickles tasting exactly like the ones their mothers used to make. The farms were filled with German recipes that had traveled across the ocean long before the prisoners had ever been born. Music created another unexpected bridge. One Sunday evening, after the chores were done, the Muller family gathered on the porch. The eldest son began strumming a guitar, plucking out an old folk melody. Otto froze, recognizing it instantly.
Tats, du liegst mir im Herzen, he whisperet. Thomas Müller nodded.
My mother sang it every night when I was little.
Otto smilet.
Mine too. Soon the prisoners were humming along. The family joined them, voices blending under the fading pink sky. By the second verse, the POWs were singing freely, hesitant at first, then stronger as the music dissolved whatever boundaries remained between them. The moment felt almost unreal, as if two worlds separated by war had met and found harmony in a simple, shared melody. Traditions, too, overlapped in unexpected ways. As Christmas approached, the Muller farmhouse transformed. Garlands of evergreen branches were hung along the porch. Candles glowed softly in the windows. When the POWs were invited to help cut a Christmas tree, Wilhelm felt his chest tighten. Back home, he and his father had always taken the same snowy walk into the forest to choose the perfect tree. Here, thousands of miles away, he followed another family into the woods, the ritual uncannily familiar. One evening, Anna brought out a plate of cookies dusted with powdered sugar. Vanillekipferl, she announced. The POWs stared, stunned. Those crescent-shaped cookies belonged to German Christmas tradition, not an American farm kitchen. Fritz took a bite and closed his eyes. My grandmother made these every winter. So did mine, Anna replied. Some things don't change just because you cross an ocean. Even the holiday customs shared roots. The family lit Advent candles, read stories passed down through generations, and hung handmade ornaments that looked exactly like the ones the POWs remembered from home. It was a strange, almost haunting experience. Familiarity wrapped in foreignness. But it wasn't just major holidays that revealed cultural parallels. Everyday habits, like the farmers greeting neighbors with hearty handshakes, brewing strong coffee before sunrise, or telling folk tales around the dinner table, felt unmistakably German. Even the architecture of barns, the layout of kitchens, and the stitched patterns in old quilts carried influences brought over by immigrants decades earlier. One evening, as the prisoners sat outside after supper, Wilhelm remarked, "It feels like we have stepped into an America built from pieces of our own country." Thomas, the farmer, smiled. "In many ways," he said, "you have. The Midwest grew from German hands as much as American ones." That truth sank deep. The POWs had expected to be strangers in a hostile land. Instead, they found echoes of family, tradition, and home woven into the American countryside. And through those echoes, a quiet understanding formed that cultures, no matter how far apart, often share the same roots. The war had divided nations, but in the kitchens, porches, and holiday rituals of the heartland, the POWs discovered something timeless. People, regardless of country, often hold onto the same songs, flavors, and traditions that remind them of where they came from. Trust was not something that appeared overnight. It grew quietly, almost invisibly, between the German POWs and the American families who worked beside them. At first, every action was cautious, every conversation filtered through the weight of war. Yet, Day by day, small gestures in the fields and farmyards began to reshape what both sides believed about the enemy. In the early weeks of their work assignment, the prisoners always moved under the watch of armed guards. The rule was simple: keep distance, keep structure, keep order. But the longer the Muller family worked with the POWs, the more those rules felt unnecessary. The German prisoners showed no interest in escape. They were fed, treated fairly, and far from the battlefields. For many, life on an American farm was safer and more humane than life in the ruins of war-torn Europe. The first true moment of trust came one afternoon during the wheat harvest. The sun was high, the air heavy with dust, and the guards had stepped away to help fix a broken tractor. Wilhelm and Otto worked steadily, loading bales into the wagon. Suddenly, a wagon wheel slipped into a deep rut, tilting dangerously. Without thinking, Wilhelm rushed forward to steady it, placing him right beside the farmer's teenage daughter, Clara. For a split second, everyone froze. The POW was not supposed to get that close. But Clara only smiled nervously and whispered, "Danke." Wilhelm nodded.
Bitte.
The guard returned moments later, not even noticing. But Clara's simple gratitude lingered in the air. It was the first time someone had spoken to a prisoner not as an enemy, but as a human being. That evening, Thomas Muller walked over to the POW group before they returned to camp. "Good work today," he said, clearing his throat. "I appreciate your help." It was a small sentence, yet it carried weight. For Wilhelm and the others, it shattered a wall they had quietly carried since capture: the belief that Americans saw them only as criminals. From then on, trust bloomed in quiet, everyday ways. Thomas began leaving tools out for them to use freely. Anna would occasionally hand the guards a basket of fresh bread and say, "Share it with the boys." And sometimes, when the guards were certain the men wouldn't run, they would sit in the shade and let the POWs work without close supervision. One morning, Otto accidentally dropped a pocket knife he had borrowed. He immediately picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and walked straight to Thomas. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to damage it." Thomas examined the knife and shrugged. Tools are meant to be used. The trust in that moment, offering, apologizing, forgiving, was something that would have been unthinkable on a battlefield. Not every camp in America was perfect, of course. Some guards were bitter. Some locals refused to interact with the German prisoners at all. But in the rural Midwest, where farmers depended on labor and prisoners depended on kindness, a quiet, practical respect grew on both sides. There was one day, however, when trust was tested. A rumor spread through the area that a prisoner from another camp had attempted escape. The guards tightened rules. Work groups were watched more closely. Conversations were cut short. The Muller family, worried, kept a polite distance. For the POWs, it felt like the fragile bridge they had built was beginning to crack. But a week later, when the wheat harvest resumed, trust found its way back in a simple, unexpected moment. Anna came out to the fields carrying a jug of cool lemonade, one of the few luxuries available during the hot summer months. She handed it first to the guards, then turned to the prisoners. "You look as thirsty as anyone else," she said gently. As Wilhelm lifted the cup to his lips, he felt something shift inside him. He had come to America expecting resentment, fear, maybe even cruelty. Instead, he found humanity, expressed not through grand gestures, but through kindness woven into the rhythm of daily life. That evening, as the POWs loaded into the truck to return to camp, Thomas raised a hand in farewell. "See you tomorrow," he called. 3 simple words, But to men who had been taught that Americans were their sworn enemies, those words were a revelation. The war still raged across oceans. Battlefields still burned. But here, on a quiet farm in the heart of America, trust had taken root. Softly, steadily, stubbornly. And for both the prisoners and the family who worked beside them, that trust became a reminder that even in wartime, humanity could survive. For months, Wilhelm had struggled to find the right words. Each time he sat down with pencil and paper, staring at the thin sheets the camp provided, he wondered how to describe the strange, contradictory world he was living in. An enemy land that felt unsettlingly familiar. But as autumn settled across the American Midwest, with golden fields and crisp evenings reminding him of home, he finally began to write. Liebste Mutter, he started. You will not believe what I'm about to tell you. He described the Muller farm, the rows of corn, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the sturdy red barn that looked almost identical to the one his grandfather had built in Hesse. He wrote about the family's German surname, their old country recipes, and their soft Midwestern accents that sounded, to him, like German spoken through a warm breeze. I never imagined that America would feel like this, he continued. Some days I forget I am across an ocean. The POWs were allowed to send letters, though heavily censored. Every envelope passed through American hands before reaching Europe. They couldn't write about guards, conditions, or military matters. Yet the personal stories, those were allowed, and those were what Wilhelm wanted most to share. He wrote about how the farmer's wife baked Apfelkuchen that tasted exactly like his mother's. He described the evenings when the family gathered with instruments and played songs he had learned as a child. They play Du liegst mir im Herzen, he wrote. Can you imagine? I heard it the first time and nearly cried. Otto sat across from him at the long wooden table in the barracks, writing his own letter. What do you tell them? Wilhelm asked. The truth, Otto replied softly, that I am safe, that the people here don't hate us, that sometimes I forget I am a prisoner. A few bunks away, Fritz was hunched over his paper, chewing the end of his pencil. I want to tell my parents about the Christmas cookies, he said, but will they even believe it? American farmers baking Vanillekipferl. The letters carried more than stories, they carried relief. For German families living through bombings, rationing, and chaos, hearing that their sons were alive and treated well was a blessing beyond measure. But Wilhelm's letters also held a quiet conflict. How could he explain that he felt a sense of belonging here? How could he admit that some days the farm reminded him of a life he might have lived if he had been born in another country? One evening, after a long day picking apples, Thomas Mahler approached Wilhelm and handed him a postcard. It showed a painting of the rolling Nebraska plains. If you want, Thomas said, send this home too. Show them what it looks like here. Wilhelm accepted the card carefully, as though it were fragile. He turned it over and wrote, This land is different, yet it feels like I have known it all my life. He didn't mention the hardest truth of all, that the more time he spent with the Muller family, the more complicated his sense of identity became. He had grown up believing Germans and Americans were opposites, destined to clash. Yet here, in the heart of America, he saw pieces of his own culture reflected back at him like a distant echo. When he finished the letter, he folded it neatly and placed it in the envelope. The next morning, a guard collected it along with dozens of others. They would travel thousands of miles, across fields, across oceans, across continents, carrying the stories of German prisoners discovering unexpected humanity in a country they had been taught to fear. Weeks later, Wilhelm received a letter in return. His mother's handwriting trembled across the page. "My son," she wrote, "your words give me hope. I pray that the people around you are as kind as you say." Wilhelm closed his eyes and nodded to himself. "Yes, Mutter," he whispered. "They are." For the first time since his capture, he felt a deep sense of peace. The letters had become more than communication. They were a lifeline, connecting two worlds that war had tried to tear apart. And through those fragile sheets of paper, Wilhelm carried home a truth that even he was still learning to understand. Sometimes the enemy's land can feel closer to home than anyone expects. Friendship was never the goal. In wartime, it wasn't even supposed to be possible. German prisoners and American civilians were meant to keep their distance, separated by uniforms, languages, loyalties, and wounds the world hadn't yet healed. And yet, on quiet farms and in rural work camps across the United States, friendship found a way to grow in the small spaces where humanity slipped past the rigid rules of war. For Wilhelm, one of the first true friendships began with something simple: a shared workbench in the Muller barn. The farmer's son, Thomas Jr., often repaired tools there, sanding handles or tightening bolts. Wilhelm, gifted with carpentry skills, would be assigned to assist. At first, their conversations were simple, cautious. "Pass the hammer," Thomas would say. "There," Wilhelm replied, keeping his voice neutral. But weeks turned into months, and those moments at the workbench became quiet meetings where two young men, nearly the same age, talked about ordinary things: family, plans, dreams interrupted by war. Thomas spoke of wanting to expand the farm one day. Wilhelm spoke of wanting to reopen his father's carpentry shop. One afternoon, as they worked on replacing a wagon board, Thomas looked up and said, "You know, Wilhelm, you're one of the best carpenters I've ever seen." Wilhelm paused, unsure how to respond. Compliments were rare for prisoners. "Danke," he whispered. "My father taught me everything." Thomas nodded. He'd be proud. That moment, small, honest, was the first time Wilhelm felt seen not as a POW, but as a person. Elsewhere on the farm, another friendship was taking shape. Clara, the Muller daughter, had always been curious about the foreign workers. She was 17, thoughtful, with a stack of library books she carried everywhere. One day, she noticed Otto reading a German novel he had borrowed from the camp library. "You've read Thomas Mann?" she asked, surprised. Otto looked up, blinking. "You know him?" "He's my favorite," she said. "I did a school report on Buddenbrooks." What began as a chance conversation grew into a routine. When Otto worked near the farmhouse, Clara would bring out a jug of water, or sometimes nothing at all except a question about literature. They talked about authors, poetry, and the strange twists of life that had brought them, improbably, to the same Midwestern yard. One afternoon, she asked him, "Do you miss home?" He nodded slowly. "Every hour. But talking like this, it helps." Clara smiled gently. "I'm glad." It was not romance. It was something simpler, gentler. Two young people finding comfort in shared curiosity, even as war raged far beyond the horizon. Then there was Fritz, whose easy humor made him popular with nearly everyone. The younger farmhands, American boys too young for the draft, loved hearing his stories. Fritz would describe mischief he'd gotten into as a child in the Black Forest. Stealing apples, racing goats, building rafts on the river that always sank in the first 5 seconds. "Did you really try to ride a goat?" one boy asked. "Yes," Fritz said proudly. For 3 glorious seconds, the boy burst out laughing. You Germans are crazy. And you Americans?
Fritz replied.
You put chili on everything. So we're even. The guards usually pretended not to notice these exchanges. After months of peaceful work, their suspicion had softened too. Once, during a midday break, one guard even let Fritz teach him a German tongue twister. Everyone laughed when the guard mangled the words. But not all friendships were loud or playful. Some were built in silence. One cold evening, Wilhelm noticed the farmer's elderly mother struggling to carry firewood inside. He quietly stepped forward, lifted the bundle, and brought it to her hearth. She placed a hand on his arm and whispered in accented English, "Danke, Junge. My parents came from Bavaria. It is good to hear our language again." From that day on, she left an extra biscuit on the table whenever the POWs worked near the house. Little by little, respect grew into something deeper, a sense of connection, of shared humanity that baffled anyone holding on to old propaganda. The prisoners were no longer faceless enemies. They were hardworking young men, sons and brothers, shaped by different circumstances but carrying the same hopes as everyone else. And when the war finally neared its end, the reality of separation began to weigh on both sides. The POWs wondered how to say goodbye. The American families wondered if they had said too much or too little. But those stories of friendship, formed in dusty barns, wheat fields, and quiet porches, would linger for decades. Because in the middle of a world divided by war, ordinary people had chosen to see each other not as enemies, but as human beings. And that choice, more than any weapon or order, proved how powerful respect could be, even in the darkest times of history. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, the news reached the POW camps with a strange mixture of relief and dread. For months, the German prisoners had sensed the turning tide. Newspapers hinted at Allied advances. Guards spoke in quieter tones, and even the farmers they worked for seemed to be waiting for something inevitable. But when the official announcement arrived, it didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like uncertainty. "Home," Wilhelm murmured to himself. "We will finally go home." Otto nodded, though his face was troubled. If home is still there. Repatriation did not happen immediately. The prisoners stayed for many more months, some even into 1946, helping with harvests and rebuilding America's labor force. But everything felt different now. The war was over. They were no longer enemies, only temporary workers waiting to return to a country they no longer recognized. The Muller family reacted quietly. One evening, Thomas approached Wilhelm as they finished repairing a fence. "You'll be leaving soon, I suppose?"
Ja, Wilhelm said softly.
"Soon." Thomas hesitated. "You've been good men, hard workers. We won't forget that." For the prisoners, the idea of leaving was far more complicated than they had expected. They had spent years building routines, friendships, even trust in this foreign land. Now they would return to a Germany shattered by bombing, hunger, and loss. As the repatriation date drew near, many POWs wrote final letters home. Letters filled not with fear, but with hope. They wanted to believe their families were alive. They wanted to imagine a future beyond ruins. On the day of departure, the atmosphere in camp was heavy. The guards lined the men up as always, but the stiffness was gone. Some guards even shook hands. One leaned toward Fritz and said, "Take care of yourself, kid. You'll do fine out there." The truck ride to the train station passed by familiar farms and towns. When the prisoners saw the Muller farmhouse one last time, Clara and her mother stood at the edge of the road. They waved, hesitant, emotional. Wilhelm lifted his hand in return. Otto lowered his head, unable to look back. The journey across the Atlantic was quiet and reflective. No fear this time, only the steady hum of the ship cutting through the water. The men gathered on deck and spoke about what awaited them. Will our villages still stand? Will our families still be alive? Will they believe what America was truly like? When Wilhelm finally stepped onto German soil, he was shocked. Buildings were flattened, roads broken. Smoke still drifted from distant ruins. The once familiar scent of bread and wood fires had been replaced by dust and ration desperation. His mother, thinner than he remembered, embraced him with trembling arms. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised I would," he said, though tears blurred his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Wilhelm, Otto, and Fritz struggled to readjust. The Germany they returned to was not the same country they had left. Food was scarce. Work was limited. Many neighbors eyed returning POWs with suspicion, unsure whether they carried blame or guilt. But the prisoners also returned with stories that surprised everyone who heard them. They described American farms that looked like Bavarian villages, families with German surnames, and Midwestern traditions that mirrored their own. Some neighbors listened with disbelief. Others listened with envy. A few even asked, "Was it truly as humane as you say?" "Yes," Wilhelm answered again and again. "Kinder than we expected. Kinder than we deserved." For some former POWs, the experience changed their entire perspective. A number later immigrated to the United States, seeking the familiarity they had found in unexpected places. Others stayed in Germany but carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Quiet proof that war propaganda had hidden more similarities than differences. Wilhelm rebuilt the carpentry shop with his father's old tools. Otto found work at a printing press, inspired by the books he'd discussed with Clara. Fritz married, had children, and told them stories about riding goats and working American wheat fields. Years later, when their children asked about the war, the former POWs rarely spoke about battles or surrender. Instead, they spoke about the kindness of strangers, the shared meals, the unexpected friendships, and the simple humanity they discovered far from home. Returning to Germany meant returning to hardship, but also returning with a deeper understanding. That even in the darkest times, people across nations could find common ground. And the familiarity they had found in America continued to echo through their lives, long after the war had ended. Long before Wilhelm and the other POWs ever stepped onto American soil, the story of German influence in the United States had already been unfolding for centuries. When the prisoners returned home after the war, many of them carried with them not only memories of kindness, but also a deeper curiosity. How had German culture become so deeply woven into American life? To understand their experiences, we must look back, decades, even centuries, into the legacy of German settlement in America. German immigration to the United States began as early as the 1680s, when families fleeing religious persecution and poverty sailed across the Atlantic to Pennsylvania. They brought with them their language, their craftsmanship, their food traditions, and above all, their work ethic. Over time, thousands more followed: farmers, bakers, carpenters, musicians, seeking freedom and land. By the mid-19th century, German communities had spread across the Midwest. Their influence was everywhere. In the red brick towns of Wisconsin, the rolling farms of Iowa, the beer halls of Ohio, and the village-style streets of Missouri. They built churches with tall steeples, opened schools where German was the primary language, and founded newspapers that served as cultural lifelines to the Old World. This vast legacy was what the German POWs unknowingly stepped into when they arrived during World War II. Wilhelm did not learn the full history until years later. But even during his time on the Mahler farm, he could feel the echoes of earlier generations, German words blended into English conversation, foods that tasted like the ones cooked in his mother's kitchen, and stories told by elderly farmers who still spoke with soft traces of their ancestors' dialects. When he returned to Germany after the war, he would tell neighbors, "It felt as if parts of our country had taken root there." Many didn't believe him at first. How could America, portrayed during the war as foreign, hostile, industrial, hold so many familiar threads? But Wilhelm was right. The legacy of German settlement shaped everything from agriculture to music. The barns that stretched across Nebraska and Minnesota were modeled after structures common in Bavaria and the Rhineland. Farming techniques, crop rotation, dairy production, orchard cultivation, carried deep German influences. Even community festivals, from Oktoberfest celebrations to Christmas markets, reflected traditions brought over by immigrants long before the turmoil of the 20th century. Some former POWs discovered that the German-speaking Americans they met were descendants of families who had left Europe during turbulent times, wars, revolutions, or famine. Instead of carrying bitterness, these families had built new lives in a new land, blending old country customs with American optimism. It was this mixture that had startled Wilhelm and the others so deeply. They had expected the new world to feel foreign, but instead they found echoes of home. As the decades passed, historians began documenting these surprising encounters. Letters from former POWs detailed their astonishment at hearing German hymns sung in American churches, eating sauerkraut on family farms, or reading recipes that mirrored ones from the Black Forest or Hesse. Some former prisoners returned to visit the communities where they had once worked. A few even emigrated permanently, drawn by the familiarity they had first noticed while repairing fences or harvesting wheat. The legacy of German culture in America didn't just shape the POW experience, it helped reshape post-war relationships. The prisoners returned home with stories that challenged stereotypes and softened old hostilities. They became living bridges between two nations that, despite the horrors of war, shared a cultural foundation built long before the conflict began. By the end of his life, Wilhelm would often reflect on how surprising that discovery had been. "I thought I understood what it meant to be German," he told his grandchildren. "Then I traveled across an ocean and found pieces of our heritage planted in the soil of another country. It taught me something important. Culture does not belong to one nation. It travels, grows, changes, and becomes part of new places." And so, the legacy of German settlement in America lived on. Not just in buildings, traditions, or foods, but in memories carried by men who had first arrived as prisoners and left with a new understanding of shared humanity. Years after the war, long after Wilhelm had returned to Germany and rebuilt his life, he found himself often reflecting on a question that had puzzled him during his time as a prisoner. What did American truly mean? It was a word he had heard countless times, spoken with pride by the farmers, whispered with confusion by fellow POWs, and used in propaganda to describe an enemy that felt distant and unfamiliar. But once he had lived and worked among everyday Americans, the meaning had become far more complex, far more human. In the small farmhouse where he had worked, Wilhelm had seen a version of America that was never mentioned in wartime speeches. The Mahler family, descendants of immigrants themselves, had shown him a mixture of discipline, generosity, and curiosity. They lived simply, worked hard, and treated strangers without fear. To Wilhelm, this was the first crack in the image he had been given. America was not a single idea. It was many. He remembered the day he and his fellow POWs helped repair a storm-damaged barn. After hours of work, the farmer brought out a large pot of stew and bread from the local bakery. As they sat on hay bales eating together, Wilhelm realized he was experiencing something that transcended nationality. Hardships, he thought, were universal, but so was the kindness that helped people overcome them. It was in moments like these that he began understanding the deeper layers of American identity. For many Americans he met, being American wasn't tied to ancestry or politics. It was tied to belief, a belief in opportunity, in starting over, in building something with one's own hands. He saw it in the faces of laborers who had come from Poland, Ireland, Italy, Mexico, and yes, Germany. None of them tried to erase where they came from. Instead, they added their heritage to the larger story. This realization struck Wilhelm again decades later, when he returned to the United States as a visitor. The train stations were larger, the farms more modern, but the atmosphere felt familiar. The mix of languages, the blend of old traditions with new inventions, and the openness toward newcomers. He met families whose grandparents had lived during the war. Some remembered the POW camps. Others recalled how their towns had quietly accepted the presence of young German men who were far from home. Many still spoke of the experience with compassion rather than resentment. These encounters showed Wilhelm something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. America, he thought, was not a place built by one group of people. It was a mosaic shaped by millions of stories. It was resilient because it was diverse. It was strong because it embraced change rather than fearing it. One quiet evening, while visiting the cemetery where some former POWs had chosen to be buried, Wilhelm felt a deep sense of connection. Several of the graves belonged to men who had returned to America after the war and made it their home. Some had married local women. Others had opened businesses. They had found in America something they could not find in post-war Europe, a sense of belonging grounded not in where they came from, but in what they believed they could become. Standing among the headstones, Wilhelm whispered, "Perhaps that is what American truly means, to build a future larger than your past." Those men had taken a place that began as a prison and turned it into a homeland. In his final years, when his grandchildren asked him what surprised him most about his time in America, he always gave the same answer. It was the people. I expected enemies, but I found neighbors. I expected pride, but I found humility. I expected distance, but I found a country made of many homes, not just one. For Wilhelm, the most enduring legacy of his time in America was the discovery that identity was not fixed. It was lived. America had taught him that a nation could be many things at once. Familiar and strange, old and new, rooted in tradition yet always moving forward. And in those reflections, he realized something profound. War had shown him divisions, but America had shown him possibilities.